So, Gareth, thank you for joining us. And first up, a starter for one to warm up with is what does the future model of real estate look like from your perspective after 9 months of this lockdown?
So no one really knows what that future design of an office might be. But I think what has happened in the last 9 months, clearly, has there been some sort of value shift from the physical office to a much more dispersed form of provision for our workforce. So going forward, take a company like PwC. I'm not going to give you exact numbers, but we're pretty clear that going forward, even after COVID, a large proportion of the workforce is going to be spending a lot more time outside of the office. So what does that mean for PwC as an organization? Well, it means that we need to start thinking about what we know and reacting to what we know, and how do we accommodate, how do we provide our workforce that's spending much less time in the office and dispersed around the country? How do we provide them with the best working conditions? How do we provide them with the best working contract to attract the right talent going forward in the future? So in many ways, my view would be the real estate side of that, the physical real estate side of that, is going to fall out of the bottom. The biggest thing that's happened is companies need to, employers need to think about how they deal with that time when the people are 60% of their time when the workforce is outside the office, for example. And then the other side of that is obviously real estate companies, businesses that have been in the traditional business of providing office space, need to make a decision as to whether they play in that space and they extract value, they exploit the opportunity that's there from that dispersed workforce, or do they just stick to what they've known and done in the past, which is the physical office? I think they should be doing the former, because if you buy into what I've just said, then the value, the huge amount of stakeholder value, has transferred into that remote part.
And this is one area I think people aren't quite appreciating how significant it could be, is that previously, for right or wrong, you took a lease, you took the office, you occupied it, you did it 5 days a week, 9 to 5 roughly, and you tried to fill that space productively with a high level of utilization to justify the cost attached to it. But in this new world, what you'll get is very, should we say, lumpy levels of occupancy with surges, whether it's seasonal surges of people going into the office, could even be dictated by future vaccination shortfalls or lockdowns, whatever you call. But it will no longer be that linear, we're going to occupy 70% of the space 80% of the time. It will be, well, in the winter, people might pack back to their hub, but in the summer, people want to work from home and enjoy more family time. And that kind of peaks and troughs is something that real estate isn't really geared up for, in my view. Hotels have always coped with it, they've had to, but now suddenly you're going to have, in my view, office providers and office landlords need to think very differently about the means of supply and how to cater for different demand. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that sort of goes to the point around, it's almost like a bigger overlap, or much more an overlap between work and home life. So understanding and interacting with, understanding when you're going to get people into the office, how you get them into the office, how you encourage them to be. These are all things that real estate providers, traditional real estate providers, could be developing expertise, technologies around, and linking that into the core, more boring part of their business, which is how does British Land get a big occupier like PwC to sign up to that core lease? Because I've no doubt that's still going to represent probably the biggest part of the value. But a condition of getting that, they're going to have to provide all these other services and help occupiers, big businesses, manage those peaks and troughs you talked about, and getting rewarded for how well they do that, as well as all this stuff when they're not in the office.
One of the things that we've been looking at is how supply currently sort of stacks up to that model. If you were to push a button today and say, let's say as an example, 5% of Central London's workforce now want to work from suburban locations, some of that will be at home, some of it may be localized offices. Actually, the supply doesn't really exist to allow for that, certainly what's available, or of a decent quality. Do you see a problem, kind of a systemic problem in the supply chain of office space in terms of the investment, and can you see that shifting going forward?
What happens is Starbucks changes its business model, for example, and decides to split half of its premises into co-working hubs and that keep the other half as traditional coffee shop. So there's a lot of space out there, and all these the uses of real estate are changing at the same time. Office perhaps the most, maybe, or also retail, but we've sort of had that trend for a little while now. So it's how amongst all of that sort of fluctuation in the use of real estate and supply and demand of real estate, whether that means that there's real value and how you predict how that market's going to turn out. But to answer your question, there is absolutely a need for the supply to meet the future demand of people working in a more dispersed way.
But it may take a while. I mean, one thing I don't think people quite appreciate is how long it may take to sort this out, because there's going to be a lot of companies trying to get themselves out of leases, break clauses and so on. It could take at least 2 or 3 or 4 years before a lot of occupiers have right-sized and pushed through the change to enable this to happen. And ironically, it could be flex leases and so on that they bin first, because it's easier to do so, rightfully so. So it's going to be short-term pain for the flex part of the sector, but landlords may have more time to adapt as clients try and extricate themselves. I mean, that's a simple way of putting it, but it's not like we'll see an overnight bloodbath as perhaps we're seeing in the retail, is it?
Yeah, I agree, and I think the amongst all these things we don't know, one thing I think I know the direction of travel, but don't know how long this is all going to take and how it plays out in the current market. But I would say one of the things I'm pretty sure about is the need for more supply of genuine flexible office space.
I mean, your comment, as an example, which was, is the office dead? I mean, from my perspective, I really don't think so. And, Gensler came out with a nice bit of research a couple of days ago that showed that actually over 50% of people, if you split their time, would actually be in an office, over a working week. In terms of, the central London, as an example, central city locations, which clearly have huge amounts of stock. And over the last 6 months, we've started to see vacancy rates creep up again, as we would expect. What do you see sort of happening in some of those markets, or how do you see? Because it's not just the landlords or the REITs that are invested; it's the cities and the governments and councils themselves as well that really are. I guess they've got skin in the game in some of those markets. What do you see, happening there, and how do you see, I guess, at a broader perspective, how do we get people back in? Maybe not to office space necessarily, but back into those urban, those locations.
Again, almost as challenging as the first question, but John asked.
Apologies, Gareth.
Bear with
Come on,
me.
Gareth, solve it. Come on.
I'll start and sort of start some sort of random thoughts. I guess I mean, the trouble with the debate over the last 9 months, and it's happening all the time. As an example of it today, I'll mention in a second. But it's this sort of polarized discussion. Office is dead. No, it isn't. Working from home is terrible. No, no, it isn't, sort of thing. And even today, I think it was it Barclays or Standard Life came out with a comment saying, working from home isn't working. And it just, these headlines create these debates that don't sort of focus on where, we all know it's going to be, which is, yes, it's not dead, or it's not, but something has happened, something significant has happened, and it's important that we sort of talk about it. But, so I think ultimately these sort of city centre locations where we've historically gone into the office are still going to be where we want to go. I certainly want to spend most of my week in those sorts of locations with flexibility and things. So over time, I'm pretty confident where we'll get to, because for whatever reason it is, we will want to be in these sort of places where there's lots of culture, where you meet more people, and so I personally feel still very positive about, say, the centre of London as a place where people are going to go. What it looks like in terms of actual real estate and a mix of real estate there is a harder one. If I think of it at a sort of granular level, and think of, say, our head office at PwC we work in over at more London Bridge, that's going to have to change to be a much more mixed use, sort of almost lifestyle oriented office where perhaps a number of floors are for co-working, meeting clients. Probably the floor at the bottom is going to be this sort of mix of
client entertainment, and knowing you're running lockers, and showers maybe.
You got it in before me, running lockers, showers, gym, laundrettes, click and collect, medical facilities, but all these things that effectively allow an employer to just have more pulling power or more weight when it's trying to get particular people to come into the office, and it's going to have to be much more smart about doing that, because the balance of power has shifted a bit, and the best employees attracting the best talent are going to be those people that can persuade people to come into the office, but not just whenever they choose at particular times. For example, I work in the real estate team. Well, everyone's working remotely, but we all agree we need to be collaborating more, and we miss each other's company, and that's when the ideas start flowing and that sort of thing. So I can see us all trying to get to the point where we're trying to persuade everyone to come into the office at least on a Wednesday afternoon, possibly more, but make sure you're in on that Wednesday afternoon, and incentivizing and giving people good reason to do that and making that an enjoyable experience, whether that's traveling in on a train to Paddington and then being able to run from there into the office because you've got your showers and lockers at the end, or whatever, or you can have your medical appointment, or you can pick up your laundry, whatever it is. It's just creating that draw to bring people in when you need them in,
to give you those options. But to answer a bit of that question from my view, but then to provoke another one from you, is for this to occur and for the transition to occur, there does need to be more flex space of varying different types. You said that yourself. But to enable that to happen, as James and I can see from the numbers, you've got to see a lot of landlords, conventional landlords, flipping their space into flex space options. So there needs to be a transformation. From our rough estimate, only 6% of conventionals of all office space is flex, and we'll need that to double at least to cater for the demand we're seeing. To your point.
Yeah, so I mean, you mentioned what we've seen already happening to a certain extent in retail, and the concept of a turnover lease, and even the last year, there's been people you've spoken to in the context of retail that said, we'll never go to turnover leases, or that's as far as it goes, but it won't go any further. And I just think that argument doesn't stack up, because there are already examples, Simon Property Group in the US, for example, buying out the retail tenants within their malls as a means to, they will say it's an investment in the business that they think they can bring back, but it's also a means to make sure that their malls aren't just empty and completely having knock-on effects to other retailers. But that's an example of an extreme example of a property landlord taking all the risk of its underlying retail. So that's just one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got a traditional lease, and then you've got a turnover lease, and there's lots of stuff in between, which is a mix and different models that are starting to emerge around how there's a risk sharing between the landlord and a tenant. And I don't see any reason why the same wouldn't happen in the office market. It's not a turnover lease in the same way we recognise in retail, because it just clearly doesn't work. But all those things we described around how you manage those peaks and troughs of employees, how you engage with employees when they're outside of the office, how you sort of provide them with the right tools and skills to make sure that coming into the office is easy, that they find it easy to collaborate with teams. These are all I would say services and offerings and bits of value that the traditional landlords aren't currently providing. The flexible office operators is much closer to what they do, but even then there's plenty of scope for growth. But I think it's those flexible office skills that it's going to come from, the flexible office operators that are providing those types of things. And it might even be completely new players coming to the market, because it might be that actually some of the technology aspects are what really adds the value to a PwC employee. I suppose that goes into the whole question around technology and things, but I just think there's this huge value to be grabbed there that traditional real estate providers aren't currently tapping into, or maybe some are a bit, but the flexible operators are. It's closer to what they're doing.
Talking of, I guess, of value, and hopefully this isn't too hard a question again. I mean, we've started to see, the flexible operators start by looking at, square footage, charging by square footage, as you'd see in a traditional space, then kind of moving on to spaces or desks, then kind of getting down into credits, whether you spend that in physical hours or in different elements around the office. Have you come across kind of any ways or any examples or hearing anything yet of how we might look at value or charge value rather in the workspace rather than at a desk rate or a square footage rate? Because I guess one of the things I'm interested in is if we're going to be measuring the value of an office differently, therefore actually will the payment of that measurement also change, going back to the landlord?
Well, there's a concept that I've seen talked about, and apologies, it may well be actually instant that come up with this, but the idea around effective density. So is a given volume of real estate, how many employees is it effectively supporting, rather than how many are actually in the building. So if a building is able to support a workforce of 100,000 people, or let's do smaller numbers, but let's say our PwC head office building at Embankment Place was able to support 40,000 employees, who some of them are obviously all into the office at different times, but managing that to mean that the effective density of that office is much higher, then I could see that starting to become a measure of value that, combined with all these other ways in which a flexible operator or a landlord adds value with all these other services I mentioned, I could see that becoming similar conversation around to the sort of turnover lease element part of it, but being a fundamental change in the way real estate is valued. And I think linked to that point, one of my ways of sort of thinking about what's happened in the last 9 months is that businesses, we don't yet know what the office is going to look like and what the requirements in terms of volume are going to be for particular businesses, occupiers, but we do know that the productive work that the workforce is going to be doing is spending less time in that office. So you start measuring, if businesses start saying, well, we don't want to start paying more to support our workforce, provide them with all the workspace and technology they need, we're going to keep that constant. Then, and we accept the argument which we talked about previously, that 60% have shifted into more dispersed ways of working, or whatever the number is, then that by definition almost means that traditional businesses, occupiers, there's going to be downward pressure on how much they would pay for their traditional office space. So businesses in the flexible office market who are able to provide that much broader range of skills, I think, a better place to come into that and create value and protect value.
No, in terms of metrics and office performance, so I go the other way. I think the better organizations were looking at utilization and productivity, and that would seem to be quite cutting edge for commercial real estate. Now that almost seems outmoded. I mean, one hypothesis I look at, which is something Chris Kane's discussed, is this shared experience value, or extrapolations thereof, whereby if you, as you say, in your more London site, want to really encourage collaboration and interdepartmental kind of serendipity, then really you want to put a value on that. And if I was a C-suite, I'd be saying, well, look, I want to see that this space is paying us back in terms of creating adjunct in the business and bringing people together. And you need to measure that as a CRE team. Tell me what I'm getting from having this space. Otherwise, I put that 40,000 square feet out in Crawley where it's cheaper. Do you know what I mean? There has to be purpose behind it, whether it's client interaction or so on. So what I'm trying to say, I suppose, is there are a whole raft of new people-led metrics that become much more critical to what would be deemed otherwise real estate performance. It's much more people performance is where the new land lies for me, I think.
But just to sort of link that into, I suppose, what I was saying around that effective density point is, in order to serve in order to add value to a workforce of a number I used, 40,000 people, that real estate, that head office would have to be tick the boxes and all the things you said and more. In other words, it has to be such a great experience when you go in that going in once a week is fine. That's what you need. That's where it serves its absolute purpose. But its effective density is huge because it's providing that unique premium experience for a larger workforce and that probably means that the actual office itself is very much a I can't remember what the term Anthony Slumbers uses, Imaginarium or whatever it is, but it's really premium, providing exactly what you need at the right point in time for the right teams and those sorts of things. So I think it's a similar point.
Yeah, no, exactly that. It's borrowing a phrase, rethinking the way we perceive these spaces, because there's just so much more you could do with them. And if you're going to lure, you raised the point. If you want to lure people out of their houses and away from their dog and their kids and stuff, there's got to be a good reason to do so, and there's got to be a viable product or service at the end of it, which makes you want to be there. It's no longer enough, is it, for contractual obligation to show up to a space? It seems totally outmoded now. So if I ever get James to leave Winchester, it would be a miracle. Otherwise he would be firmly ensconced there, right?
It would take a lot. Yeah.
Oh, I love an hour commute every morning.
Well, but that's a fair point. I mean, we've seen Bloomberg have already said they will incentivize people returning to work, or treat it as a part of their salary or cost that they'll pay for people to commute again to get them back into the workplace. In other words, how do you incentivize the experience to make it deemed worthwhile? I think a lot of operators have done that for a while because that allows them to charge more, and that's a fair economic way of doing so. For employers, it's something else altogether. It is making sure the best people come together to do their best work, and it should always been thus. But it's been incongruously, it hasn't been, has it? It's a total change in mindset for the way that occupiers now drive the market, I would argue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's another one of those sort of binary conversations sometimes that mean you sort of miss out on the what's actually happening. I had conversations with some people where they would say, well, the economy is going to go into a downturn. Basically, everyone's going to be scared about their jobs. So all I need to do as a boss of this company is tell everyone they've got to be in the office, and they're going to come running in because they don't want to lose their jobs. It's sort of like that's one way of looking at it, but you're sort of then ignoring the fact that something has happened, and the best companies attracting the best talent still have to therefore respond to this new world and competition. And if they want to continue being successful, then they need to think about how do we get people in effectively, and how do we manage our real estate costs effectively, and that sort of thing. So
thanks so much for joining us today, Gareth. It's really useful as ever. I think there's tremendous scope for discussion around space as a service and the office as a solution. There's so much more to discuss, but I suppose it really is this shift in perception and seeing how things play out, because we're pretty early on in the road. There's a lot more road to be traveled before we get to conclusions. But I think the scope for landlords at most to be looking at this very hard now is probably the game, right? This is the moment they should be thinking about everything as being possible.